Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our special show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the 16th G20 Summit. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is participating in the 16th G20 Summit being held in Rome on 30th and 31st of October. The summit is very significant in view of COVID-19 pandemic. With the theme People, Planet and Prosperity, discussions are being held on recovery from the pandemic and strengthening global health governance, economic recovery and resilience, climate change and energy transition, and sustainable development and food security. India fully supports the priority areas of the summit, and G20 has also acknowledged India's leadership on global concerns and has supported views of India on a wide array of issues. Now, G20 has emerged as the premier global forum for international cooperation. The grouping represents 80% of the world's GDP, 75% of the global trade, and 60% of the world's population. Italy is holding the presidency of the G20 this year, and India will take on the G20 presidency during 1st of December 2022 to 30th of November 2023 term. We will discuss and analyze all aspects of the summit in this episode of Perspective. And for more on this, we're joined by our distinguished panel of guests. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Pramit Pal Chaudhary, who's joining us here, Foreign Affairs Editor with Hindustan Times. We're also joined by Ms. Elizabeth Braw. She is Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And Professor Harshvi Pant is also joining us, Head of the Strategic Studies Program at ORF. Welcome, all of you, to Sansad TV. Let me begin with you, Pramit, and let's start by laying down for our viewers not only the key points, key agenda points with the G20 summit, but also the significance of this global grouping.
Well, the G20 was put together when it was realized that the G7, which was the original sort of multilateral rich economy club, was simply too small, that the lack of China, the lack of India and other emerging economies made the G7 too limited. And therefore, under President Bush, in fact, it was expanded, well, the new body was created, which was the G20. And actually, it's often G23 or 24 because a few other countries are always added as special guests. So in this summit will not be a particularly, in my view, important one in the sense that I don't think it'll go down in the history books, partly because the pandemic has made it somewhat difficult to get things done. But you have, I think, a three-point agenda one will be climate. And as you know, it will be immediately followed by the COP26 summit in Glasgow. So this G20 will act as should we say, a herald to what may hopefully come out of the COP26. Second, of course, will be COVID. And we've already had a number of vaccine comments and statements and stuff, but we expect more on that front. And then finally, some issues on the world economy. For example, the global minimum corporate tax, the reform of the WTO will be among the issues that the G20 will be handling and commenting on.
Okay. Let me bring in the other two panelists here as well. I'll start with you, Elizabeth, and to understand it in more broader terms, the significance of the G20 grouping 1 and 2, as Pramit was pointing, three key aspects this time around. Obviously, climate change, because this summit will be immediately followed by the COP26 as well. And the key focus area seemingly is the recovery, economic recovery and health recovery post-pandemic.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's important to consider that while this may not be a very significant summit in the history of the G20, the fact that it's taking place is, in a sense, important in itself, because G20, we have to remember, its history is one of globalization, globalized economy, but all of that is beginning to crumble as a result of the confrontation between the West and China primarily. So there aren't really nothing really can be taken for granted anymore. Progress can't be taken for granted. So, I mean, it seems like maybe poor consolation that it's taking place at all. But I think we should remember that it's very important. Unfortunately, some of the key players are missing, but nevertheless, it's taking place, and there is effort by the participants to create some sense of global recovery, which has turned out to be more difficult than anticipated even just a few months ago.
Okay. Professor Pant, the theme itself, signifies a lot, people, planet and prosperity, and the key discussion areas, the key focus areas there when we are looking at 16th G20 summit. It is pretty indicative, and even if we, look at this aspect of whether or not it is significant, the very fact that these leaders are meeting there and they are going to hold those discussions, obviously they will be one step forward, but then there remains a lot which needs to be done.
Indeed, I think, the global economy is trying to revive, and most countries today are looking at this crisis primarily through the lens of a health and wealth crisis. So as the health crisis subsides relatively, the fact that, as Elizabeth was pointing out, the fact that the summit is happening underscores that new reality that finally the world is turning a corner, that we are moving forward with a certain kind of pace on global economy. The world leadership is committed to reviving that economy. So I think that shows that top leaders of the world are now concentrating their minds on what perhaps can be done on that front. As the health crisis is managed. And I think we will hear a lot about health, vaccines. We are already hearing a few, notes from certain countries as to about mutual validity of the vaccines, the help that certain parts of the world need when it comes to the most powerful economies of the world coming together and helping the most vulnerable. I think those questions, and then the questions of how do you make sure that economic revival happens in a manner that in the context of the Glasgow summit also becomes, also is greener and also is climate sustainable. So I think we are, all these questions today are interlinked in the manner that we have not talked about these issues in the past. Today, most of these questions, again, where they look at geopolitical competition, what that competition means for global economy, after a long time, you have had a chance to again underscore the need for global economic order rather than regional or national economic orders. And then how do we move forward in solving some of these crises like the health crisis or the climate crisis, because they are all now interlinked within one particular framework. And how do you move that conversation forward is going to be the most important aspect. And I think there'll be a lot riding on the statement that comes out of G20, because at the moment the world is fragmented. Again, as Elizabeth was pointing out, you have two major powers looking entirely in different ways at the present crisis. And on most of these fronts, how do you propose solutions? I think that's going to be a major challenge. And for G20 to come out with a coherent statement, if at all they come out with it, I think would be an important test.
Okay, statements apart, but coherent action is something which obviously is going to be the way forward, and people, the leaders will have to come to that agreement. But Pramit, as Professor Pant and Elizabeth both are pointing, let's look at these issues one by one. And in the post-pandemic scenario, the most important aspect is vis-a-vis the COVID vaccines. One. Two, acceptability of vaccines so that, the world economic order can move ahead in the post-pandemic world at the same pace as it used to around 2.5 years back. That is going to be one important cornerstone.
Yeah, I think that especially for India, and we've already seen India has been saying this in the run-up to the G20, that getting, should we say, an acceptance of vaccines, passports or vaccine certificates across the world to allow the free flow of people through is going to be one of the keys as a necessary step, if you wish, to allow a return of a certain degree of normalcy in the international system. The second part of that, of course, is that going to be, as you mentioned, just the sheer need for vaccines, particularly for Africa. It's really the only continent left now where you're still seeing very little vaccination, and if there's going to be any new COVID variants arising that may cause vaccine escape later on, immune escape, it'll come out of Africa. And India, as you know, is one of the largest exporters and manufacturers of vaccines, has to be part of that game. But yes, the issue of getting the vaccines accepted, the certifications accepted, I think we'll get a G20 commitment in principle on that idea, but getting the various regulatory systems to therefore then accept the various vaccines, as we know we're struggling with the WHO on Covaxin, and then getting the certification process to be harmonized, is going to be difficult.
And really important as well, because that is one difficulty which will have to be tackled immediately. Elizabeth, do you agree that that is going to be one of the key important elements which these leaders at the G20 summit will have to find a solution to, vis-a-vis the vaccine availability, one part, making sure that everybody in the world do get their share of vaccines, and second, acceptability of different vaccines in different corners of the world?
Oh, absolutely. And there's an additional aspect. It was just mentioned that the regulatory acceptance by the different countries of other countries' regulations. And I think that's something that we'll see become a much more important issue, not just with regards to vaccine, but in every area of the globalized economy, because China is trying to essentially make its standards a global standard. And we have, on the other hand, the US, which has long been sort of an anchor of global standards. And then the European Union is trying to assert itself. So as part of this increasing geopolitical competition that is, or confrontation even, that was unthinkable or unlikely 20 years ago or 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, all of the things that we've been taking for granted, including boring things like regulation, can no longer be taken for granted, and as a result become an important issue at summits like this one.
Okay. Professor Pant, this summit being closely followed by COP26, another key element is obviously going to be discussions which are going to be centered around the issue of climate change. Now, this is going to be one forum before COP26 for some of these nations to convey their views, come to some sort of agreement before they sit on around that table in COP26 and indulge in hard negotiations.
Yeah, I think this is going to be an important platform for that, because I think in some ways G20 captures that essential divide that has been really heart of the climate negotiations between emerging countries and developing countries and the developed world. And India, I think, traverses that relationship, that divide, that fault line relatively effortlessly in some ways. It has conveyed some of those concerns very clearly, that as we aspire for some higher commitments, we also need to ensure that the economic recovery, that economic revival remains at the heart of the agenda. And therefore, for a country like India, it is important to make sure that those two are in alignment. So I think this certainly is going to be an important platform which gives voice to some of those criteria that are going to be embedded now going forward in Glasgow. And climate being, as I mentioned earlier, now essentially integrated with the larger economic revival agenda, that as we move towards an economic revival, we are also looking at the kind of technologies that would be needed to ensure that the transition is seamless, that the transition is, is green and is also environmentally sustainable. That is going to be very important, because for the developed world, it is going to be an important signal to send out to the rest of the world that they are willing to commit resources and finances and technology towards that economic revival via the climate agenda. And I think that's something that will be that will be reflected in the G20 conversations, and will be highlighted, if nothing else, by India in particular, because that's a conversation that India has been integrally involved from the very beginning. Okay. It has modified its stance, it has evolved in a particular direction. But I think this at the heart, India can represent both sides of this equation, both sides of this divide, much more interestingly and innovatively than many other countries. Okay. So I think many eyes will be on India as to what it says here and again at Glasgow.
Okay. Pramit, obviously, vis-a-vis climate change, the major action will be in COP26. All eyes will be there when, these leaders will be sitting together on the 1st and 2nd of November, and then, further negotiations and declarations afterwards. But when we're looking at G20 and when we're looking at the issue of climate change, it becomes really interesting to see what these leaders will have to say, what these nations, after the meetings will come out and talk about.
No, as you said correctly, the G20 economies represent the bulk of the world GDP, and therefore also the bulk of the world's carbon production. They also control the bulk of the technology that we hope to be using and applying to save the world from climate disaster. So what we will see the G20 is really more about broad commitments rather than any specific national policies, which will be largely kept to the COP26 under the NDCs. So we will see a recommitment to the 1.5 degrees centigrade thing, which of course I don't think we're right now we're not on the path to holding as far as the world's temperatures are concerned. But probably also an attempt to begin the battle against methane, the one gas which is effectively still not green friendly. And so I think a commitment to cut methane usage and production will be there as well. The real bigger battle will be about the questions of things like green finance, sharing of the technology, decarbonization in various other elements. And I suspicion that a lot of that will eventually be held over into the COP26 and future negotiations.
Okay. Elizabeth, what are your expectations in terms of the issue of climate change and the discussions being held in G20, specifically when we're talking about the rising temperatures and the greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, unfortunately, my expectations are not very high, and that's because China it talks a good game about being carbon neutral by 2060, but it's not taking the steps required to become carbon neutral by 2060. For example, it is expanding its coal, or it's building new coal power plants, and not just building new coal power plants in China. It's financing the construction of coal power plants in developing countries. That is possibly the worst thing you can do if we are to have a realistic chance of moving towards the 1.5 centigrade goal that we know is necessary. And if China doesn't commit to doing what's necessary, then it can talk all it wants about CO2 or carbon neutrality by 2060. It's not going to happen, and we as a planet are not going to have a chance of meeting our 1.5 degree goal.
Okay, so fair enough. A lot of expectations there, but some obviously skepticism also in terms of what might actually happen. And when we're talking about climate change, we'll have to eventually wait for COP26 because that is where the actual action will be. But Professor Pant, I'd like to bring you in here and let's look at, from an Indian perspective again. You earlier spoke about how India has a very important role to play when we're talking about the issue of climate change. But when we are looking at, the G20 as an organization and its evolution, India's role there, 1, 2, also the way India's actions, global actions, and the stand and views have been accepted by the global community at large, given the fact that in just another 2 years' time, India will be hosting all these nations for a G20 summit.
Yes, indeed. I think this has been a very interesting and important journey for India as well as for the global order because, as we were discussing earlier, G20 emerged out of a particular context in which the G7 group of nations realized that they cannot frame the rules of global governance without bringing in, these new countries, emerging powers like India. And I think where India stands out is that I think a lot of the time, we have been discussing earlier debates and issues where China has now taken a position which is distinctly about a sense of revisionism in the global order. That China is challenging the norms and the fundamentals of the global order that have been laid out. India, on the other hand, is a country today as a democracy, as a country that believes in certain normative values and institutionalized principles, that is willing to sustain this international order and willing to navigate this divide between different factions, East, West, developing, developed. And in that sense, India stands as a category of its own. It's a rising power. It's a power that is seen as increasingly shaping the normative consensus globally. It is providing new ideas. If you look at climate change, for example, whether it is Solar Alliance or disaster resilience initiative, I think India has provided a lot of alternatives to the prevailing ideas on the table, and at the same time is willing to work with other like-minded countries to shape the leadership vacuum or to fill that leadership vacuum that the world is feeling. So in that context, for India to hold the summit 2 years down the line from today, and also to work with its commitment to work with other countries stands out when you are looking at the fault lines becoming so much sharper in global politics and global security. So I think for the world now, it is a question of engaging India. It's a question of bringing India into the fold much more strongly. And for India, it's a question of how far it will travel when it comes to leadership, Prime Minister Modi has committed India to a certain kind of a leadership style, to a certain kind of commitments on the global stage, from climate change to vaccines to economic revival. If you see, of all the countries in the world today, India has taken the kind of steps in favor of globalized economic order that few other countries have taken in recent months. So in a sense, for India to deliver is very important. For the world, it's very important that India delivers and produces results. And for India itself, it's important to deliver results so that it can work with other countries to shape the global order in much more productive ways and much more substantive ways. So I think as India moves forward to its own G20 summit 2 years down the line, this will be an important marker from now on as to how India works with other countries to shape the global agenda. And again, climate change, whether it is economic revival, whether it's the health crisis, on all these questions, India has some very interesting and important things to say, and to make other countries commit to certain goals that perhaps would not be possible if India is not in the driving seat. So I think we are going to look at an interesting ride for India over the next 3 years.
Okay, Pramit, do you agree with what Professor Pant is saying, that this is the time when India is in a unique position in the global order, and from here onwards, how we carry on the global issues, the way we take them on, provide solutions as well, is going to be really important?
Well, it's going to be an interesting game because India has not been a major player in the international system in terms of actually providing tangible, should we say, solutions until recently. We now have some capacity. I'm a little careful because I think the international order, as others have mentioned, between the fact that you have great power rivalry making really broad multilateral responses increasingly difficult. So you can see the Quad, for example, is now developing itself into a group that is addressing a lot of global problems, but doing so ex-China. So the question for us will be, given that we still retain a decent relationship, let's say, with Russia, and a partially relationship with China that's of course, under extreme pressure, can we bridge that gap between what were slowly rising plurilateral solutions like the Quad and so on, as compared to a very large G20 type structure? Do we have the political capacity more than anything else to bridge the gap between these two sort of levels of multilateralism? And that's something we're going to have to see over the next 1.5 years.
So it's obviously going to be a wait and watch situation. Elizabeth, your concluding comments there are in terms of your analysis vis-a-vis India's position in the global order, the scheme of things there, provider of solutions, a kind of nation which can come up with tangible solutions to the problems which the world is facing, and specifically when we are looking at a grouping like G20.
I think India is in a unique position because there is the loss of faith in China in the Western world over the past couple of years is so dramatic, and yet you need a partner, and India clearly doesn't play the same role in Western economies or in the global economy yet as China does, but it could be on a path towards replacing China, certainly because it's seen to have more values in common with the rest of the world than China does. So I think this is a unique moment that India can capitalize on. Okay,
there it is. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, as well as Professor Harsh Pant and Pramit Pal as well, for sharing your views and insights as our experts were pointing out the detailed analysis of the 16th G20 summit and, of course, the larger role which India has been playing and is set to play in the global order as well. We'll come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.